Super, thank you.
So I'll now introduce Paul Hammett from the NFU, who will be talking about the NFU's new integrated water management strategy. Paul, would you like to share your screen, or would you like me to present it?
I'll give you that pleasure if I could, Sam, please.
That's fine. If you just want to introduce yourself, Paul.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Before.
So I'll start by thanking you for inviting me to the conference. I'm Paul Hammett. I lead on water resources for the NFU. Although I live in the catchment and these days work from home in the catchment too, I could probably see the River Kennet from the roof of my house if ever I chose to climb up there. My interest in the catchment is in its status as one of the most important producers of water-intensive crops, potatoes, carrots, onions, salads in the country. And for that reason, as it will become apparent as I move through the presentation, I was really pleased to hear at the top of the meeting that the Water for Tomorrow project is finally kicking into life, and indeed congratulations to Aquari on her appointment as project manager, which I think is really good news. So if you can immediately move on to my next slide for me, please. I suppose my starting point on what the NFU has been doing over the last few months, it comes as a reflection of the way that we're all grappling with fluctuating weather patterns, extreme weather events. So as I'm sure you all know, we've gone through yet another winter of flooding, waterlogged fields, hampering agricultural operations through the autumn and now the spring. And then as I look at out my window this morning, I know that today farmers are already looking anxiously up their rain gauges, which remain static, and irrigation is already starting to cross the catchment. So it's that weather and long-term climate change that's really driving this along. 2020 saw the second agricultural drought in 3 years, and for me one that affected not just growers of water-intensive crops in the south and east of the country, but one that touched every farm type in every region across England. And so NFU focus is on how we can best help our members respond to these weather challenges. And we've had, we've worked really closely with the Environment Agency, for example, on abstraction licensing flexibility for growers over the past 2 or 3 years. And we're working increasingly closely with water companies about how we can minimise the impact of main supply disruptions, particularly on livestock farms. But we recognise that we need to move beyond the knee-jerk response to emergency planning. And that's why we've produced a strategy document, although the more I think about it, the more I think it's an NFU manifesto, but hey, what's in a word? We've produced this document to really bring together a set of NFU policies that apply to both issues around too much water and not enough water, and around the themes of how we can plan, how we can prepare, and how we can invest in our long-term resilience within agriculture, and hopefully with outcomes for other sectors too. We've included within the strategy some pledges on behalf of our farming members, because we think that we all have a role to play in driving down water and energy waste. And it's because we all recognise, we've heard this several times this morning already, we know that we will face in the longer term more pressures as a result of housing growth, climate change, and increased environmental regulation. And it's understanding the impact, I think, or preferably lack of impact of different farming operations on the environment become more important as we go along and as environmental rules continue to bite. I've said that farmers are vulnerable to risk of climate change, but also to this change in the adoption of regulation that's been driven by climate change risks. And in my role within NFU, within Water Resources, in terms of abstraction, we know that the passage of the Environment Bill through Parliament has been delayed again, but it will be back soon, and it will be back with the promise of stricter rules on farmers and everybody else's ability to abstract water, with rules potentially effective from the year 2028, which gives us 7 years to prepare for a new regulatory landscape, which again is why projects such as Water for Tomorrow is so important. So my next slide refers to the flood risk side of this two-sided coin. We know that farmers have a role to play in managing flooding through the capture and storage of surplus water on land. But we do think that when that happens, when farmers are providing that service in mitigating flood risk, it must be part of a planned total catchment approach, not as an ad hoc emergency response of spilling surplus water because we can. And we're also very clear that farmers must be fairly compensated for what they deliver, that public good, in minimising the impact of flooding on, for example, urban areas downstream. The next slide covers our approach to drought risk. So our strategy document provides a fuller description of extreme weather risks faced by each sector of farming, horticulture, dairy, arable and the like. And we've also produced a set of short supplementary commentaries on the risks faced in each region. So I particularly recommend you take a look at our 2-page regional priorities for East Anglia. And we've also produced a series of case studies that describe different ways in which farmers are already rising to these challenges. That's by capturing and storing surplus water in reservoirs and in tanks to use at times of need and in shortage. And by the ways in which farmers are increasingly using smarter and better targeted applications of water that exactly fit with crop needs. And the ways that farmers are increasingly now using the adoption of runoff attenuation features such as sustainable drainage systems. And of course, we recognise the importance of soil management within all this, and we're looking increasingly at the ways in which farmers can improve their soil cultivation techniques, in this case, to lock moisture into soils. And obviously that's beneficial for both water quantity and water quality if we can also use soil management to mitigate surface water flooding. These actions, we think, are already helping farmers to tackle some of these challenges in their wider sense, be it water quality or water quantity, either too much or too little. We also are very clear that in future the pressures that farmers face might be so great that they'll not always be capable of being solved at the individual farm level. And that's where the cooperation within the farming community and collaboration with other sectors such as the water companies will become an increasingly important part of our response. And we've already seen, and we have cited examples of ways in which farmers are beginning to link up to protect their access to vulnerable water supplies. So the Broad and Abstractor group, which will be part of Water for Tomorrow, up in the Norfolk Broads, they're working together to gather and commission evidence of environmental condition and technical evidence to understand the relationship between abstraction and environmental impact, to protect their abstraction rights, but that information is being made broadly available to help collective decision making. In the East Suffolk catchment, again within Water for Tomorrow, a group of farmers over there have entered into a collaborative scheme to grab fresh water just before it goes through the seawall at the Felixstowe Peninsula and pipe it back inland into a network of farm reservoirs for irrigating use. And here in the CamEO catchment, farmers in the Lark are piloting ways in which they can share existing water rights to optimise their overall use of water. And I know that you'll hear more about that particular project tomorrow morning. There's some really exciting developments, therefore, coming from local farmer groups themselves. We realise that we can't do this on our own, that the catchment approach is vital as part of all that. And indeed, the strategy, the NFU strategy, calls for more leadership from government departments to drive forward these type of catchment solutions. And of course, as ever, we need funding. In our case, we need funding to build storage, whether it's built infrastructure or green storage. We need funding for the pumps and pipes to distribute water and for the kit to monitor and better measure water use. And meanwhile, we've got an eye on the development of regional water plans that Steve at WRE spoke about earlier, and the planning groups that across the country, the government sees as an important opportunity for us within agriculture to work more closely with other sectors. And I think a good example of that has been the way in which, as I said, we've had 2 drought years in the last 3, that Anglian Water has worked really helpfully and constructively with Fenland farmers in the middle level to share water during the height of agricultural drought. So my next slide, Sam, please, talks about the vision of what we're trying to create. And that's really to put agriculture at the heart of sustainable use of land and water, but crucially for us, while continuing to feed the nation. And that continuing to feed the nation is really important because in the UK, some 3/4 of the water embedded in the food that we eat is imported. And much of that embedded water comes from countries facing even greater climate risks than we do here in the UK. And so as we try to understand better the long-term implications for global trade following our exit from the UK, and the risk of food supply disruptions caused by pandemics, such as we saw during the early part of 2020, we think there's a real opportunity here for our farmers to deliver climate-friendly food production. And so our vision is about securing a fair share of water for agriculture and horticulture to grow our food, and for establishing the agri-food sector as an essential user of water. The vision is about driving technological innovation to improve the way that we manage both flooding and water use. And it's about further developing that agricultural productivity whilst protecting and enhancing our environment. My next slide, I should have said that, so my next slide please, Sam. I should have said from the outset that this integrated water management strategy for the NFU is conceived as like a natural companion piece for our existing commitment to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2040. And our net zero work, that's now 2 or 3 years old, we've been struck by the way that ambition has opened up some really important conversations that we're having with other organisations and other sectors. And we want our water strategy to do the same. So, and that's why we've included a short set of pledges that commits our farming members to better forward planning, to play their part in reducing waste in water and energy, and improving land management practices to improve water quality. And so finally, my next step slide, my last slide, we launched this strategy at a live event for NFU members at the end of January as a first step to achieving member buy-in for our ideas. And we're now taking this strategy to other organisations to start a conversation. And we've already, and that's already opened up dialogue with supermarkets, with government's climate change committee, and with the Environment Agency's Water Leaders Group, which oversees the river basin management planning process, to name just a few. And that's my opportunity to open up the conversation here in the CamEO catchment. So thanks for that opportunity. I'm going to pass immediately over to Andrew Francis, Director of Farming Operations at Elveden Farms, to bring this to life as a farming case study. And over to you, Andrew, please.
Thank you very much, Paul, and good morning, everybody. Yeah, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Andrew Francis. I'm Farms Director at Elveden Farms. For those of you not familiar with our business, we're focused on the production of irrigated root vegetables on both sandy and silt-based soils. And in addition to root vegetables, we also grow cereal crops, sugar beet, oilseed rape, and vine and peas. I've sort of had a look at, I suppose, the two issues we're talking about, sort of flood risk and water shortage, and split them into their two components. If we start with flood risk, the impact for us as growers are to, I suppose the first stage is really, primary objective is to recognise flood risk areas and introduce planned measures to avoid that risk and manage the impact. Flooded areas can lead to crop loss due to soils becoming anaerobic. Roots need to breathe, so long periods underwater causes death and obviously financial loss. We can negate some of this through management of cropping, soil structure work, using non-planted areas, and also occasionally spring planted only cropping rotations in very high risk areas. Loss of soil structure is a possible outcome of flooding incidents. Slump soils do not drain very well. Soil biology really struggles in airless soils. And so if we do get flooded areas, then we aim to improve soil structure through mechanical and biological intervention. Biological intervention involves establishing deep-rooted cover crops to put air channels back into the soil and get the soil sort of microbiology working again and that whole system going. Loss of nutrients, another potential problem. So our aim here is to plant headland cover crops on areas that we think may be at any risk of erosion through flooding, to make sure that we capture nutrients or any silt particles and stop them leaving the field. Land drainage is absolutely vital on our heavier soils to avoid waterlogging and its associated problems. Investment and justification are challenging, but a well-functioning drainage system is an essential part of good soil structure management. Is water capture a solution? Paul mentioned it. Can we help the water cycle in our catchment by storing excess water for times of shortage? We're involved in both cross-sector and agriculture-specific initiatives to look at high flow capture of river water to help mitigate local flooding issues. This requires slick regulation, real-time monitoring, and fast communication and decision-making. theoretically practical, but there are potentially significant financial barriers to success, and it relies on the water balance across a whole year or multiple years to be no less than we currently receive. If we can make it work, it will help smooth availability during drier summers, but does rely on that water being replenished at some point over a 1 or 2 year cycle. So looking at longer term resilience, there are two critical times for us. The first one is groundwater recharge, which primarily happens with autumn and winter rainfall. It is the rainfall that falls during our growing season, which dictates the demand for our irrigation. Now, I see our growing season as the start of April through to the end of August, and that's our absolutely key time, and that's what we might term as an agricultural drought period. Very important to mention that 75 to 90% of the content of the root vegetables we grow is water, so water is absolutely vital to us. Over the last 10 years, looking at our rainfall data, we've received 16% less rainfall during that period than the previous 10-year average. That has to come from somewhere. And during the most recent 10 years in that period, we've had what I would term a financially impactful drought for 4 of those years, with a decrease in rainfall in the growing season has been more than 25% below average. Those years were 2018, 2015, 2013 and 2011. The impact of this is that we must think about how we can access and store water during times of abundance, how we might be able to manage with less rainfall in this key period. Managing with less will be a combination of factors. Advances in plant breeding could allow us to grow alternative drought resilient crops. Plant breeders developing varieties of our existing crops which are more stress tolerant, or possibly moving crop production indoors to controlled environment farming, where environmental conditions can be controlled and the influencing factors that impact us so significantly at the moment come under controlled computer-based systems. This as a solution, I think, is some years away from being a viable alternative on a broad scale. And this is due to the limit of crops that can currently be grown in this type of environment at a commercially viable level. So what are we doing? Water demand monitoring. The first thing is we need to know what we need. We know that our soils hold around 50 millimetres of total water before they become overfull, which brings problems to crop production. Of this 50 millimetres, only half is readily available and does not cause the plant a degree of stress or extra work to access it. Therefore, knowing exactly how much water is available on any day for all our crops is vitally important to manage how much we need to supply. We use soil moisture probes to tell us in real time what water is available. We then use weather stations and crop growth models to look at the size and development of crop, proximity to harvest, and potential output to decide how much water our plants need on a daily basis. From this, we then create an irrigation plan, which tells our operators which run within each field to do each morning or evening and how to apply. Using weather forecasts and electronic rain gauges, we can modify this plan instantly if we get an unscheduled rain event. We apply water through fine rotating nozzles on irrigator booms, which require a high infiltration rate of the soil. We also use rain guns, which supply a coarser droplet and work well on soils where the infiltration rate is slower. We also use drip irrigation systems on certain soil types and certain crop scenarios. Soil type and structural condition can heavily influence the success or failure of each type of application. Each of the systems has positive and negatives to its use, so we find a combination allows us maximum flexibility in looking to achieve optimum water use. Looking forward, we're trialling different organic products which allow soils to absorb more moisture and increase plant uptake at lower availabilities. In simple terms, this technology is to reduce the surface tension of a water droplet so that it requires less resistance for root hairs to penetrate it. It also allows droplets to be absorbed better by soil particles and as well as other water droplets, which hopefully helps reduce runoff during moderate weather events. This is very much a work in progress and very early days. Mechanically, I have some ideas around some novel ways of trying to apply water to our bed systems from overhead without applying any to non-crop wheelings. But again, this is still very much experimental. The key take-home message is that commercial irrigation requires uninhibited availability as the application timing is vitally important. Once we have committed to grow a crop for our customers, we need to be able to manage all its requirements without fear of limitation. Water not only hydrates plants, acting as the transfer system within the plant and providing structure to the plant cells and the plant framework, it is also vital as a transporter of nutrients or food through the plant root hairs to enable it to access enough food to grow. At harvest time, suitably hydrated cells are essential to minimise damage through the handling and storage process and provide optimum quality and taste experience for our customers. Accessing optimum water for our crops keeps us financially sustainable and allows us to produce the right quality of food, which keeps food waste to a minimum. Optimising the saleable fraction of our crops enables us to minimise our carbon, water and our environmental footprint. Thank you very much.
Andrew. So there's been plenty of activity in the chat, so I will start relaying some of the questions across to both Paul and Andrew now. So from Helen Brower, this is directed to Paul, I think, at the NFU. Do you promote improving soil health as well as abstraction planning within sporadic rainfall we now have? This has to be key for sustainable agriculture.
Yeah, I mean, I refer to it only obliquely, but suffice it to say that soil health is a really important key part of this whole picture. And from my end, that's by locking moisture into soil. And I think that we are increasingly looking at techniques in how that can be done, notwithstanding that you know, annual root crops. It's, you know, we need to find clever ways to do that. But yes, certainly soil health is a key element.
And another one for Paul. How do you see the carbon footprint of new water sources impacting on your net zero targets? And sort of tagging onto that, what methods are the NFU looking at to achieve net zero?
Well, I think we all know that water is a heavy commodity and so energy intensive and carbon intensive to move around. I think that the advantage that farmers have over many other users perhaps is that they are using a local source of water that either runs past their farm or is already underneath it. Nevertheless, I think that that farmers are really conscious of the energy usage that's wrapped up in pumping water on farm. But I think that it's possibly somewhere where we can look more with the water sector within the regional planning that we've talked about. So, for example, it would not, you know, if we're looking at how to share resources better in the future, it makes no sense to me for irrigation, you know, abstraction rights to be restricted on a farm, for a farmer then to be able to share access and in water source from 20 miles away. So we need to think around all that. In terms of net zero, well, we're looking at the sorts of things that you would expect, land management, animal husbandry, but really trying to think of ways in which we can both boost productivity whilst reducing emissions, and how we can capture carbon in farmland.
Brilliant, thanks Paul. And so one from Robert Stanford, with the current projected increase in demand and uncertainties around rainfall, is it probable that there will be periods when there is insufficient supply to meet demand in the future? Where does farming fit in the list of priorities, and what is the mechanism to manage water distribution to stakeholders based on the priority?
Right, so I've mentioned the fact that we've locally experienced 2 agricultural droughts in the last 3 years. The effect of that is that some farmers are already restricted in their access to water at critical times, whilst because of the forward planning perhaps of the water companies, customers' ability to use water for any use carries on restricted. So I think there's an operational issue and a political issue in here. I think that farmers over the past 2 decades have got better at preparing for a single year drought by building more reservoir storage, by looking at spreading their sources, and by improved efficiency in the way they use water, but it has to get better. And in this context, it's maybe we need to quickly move towards farmers preparing for multi-year droughts. I certainly think there's something in there about how we raise the importance of this. It's on my final slide there, the essential nature of water for food production, which I would argue is not necessarily an issue for every catchment in the country, but in some of our catchments, and CamEO would definitely be one of them, we need to find a way in which agricultural access needs to rise up the pecking order to ensure that we can feed the nation.
Thanks very much, Paul. So there's one from Sam Hurst here. Do we think that we'll see greater pressure on groundwater abstraction for agricultural purposes, despite the relatively small volumes compared to water companies?
I expect there to be more regulatory pressure on farmers' access to groundwater, and it's really something, coming back again to Water for Tomorrow, it's something I'd really like to see an examination of what farming impact on our aquifers is, bearing in mind that it's and I appreciate that it's quite intensive when it happens, but it's only over a few short months of the year, and even in a catchment like the CamEO, the agricultural quota, if you like, of the overall water availability is fairly modest. So I think that, you know, in view of agriculture's seasonality and proportionality, I'd like to see us explore how ways in at least agriculture can retain its existing access to aquifer water, not necessarily seek to increase it.
Thanks, Paul. Perhaps one for Andrew, based on experience using innovation, but how can we get more farmers to move from spray guns to much more efficient booms and change practice so that irrigation takes place at times and in weather conditions when it is most effective and least wasteful, e.g. not in high sun in the middle of the day?
Yeah, I think that's a tricky one. There are lots of sort of knowledge exchange events that take place across the sector, across the industry, that look at irrigation efficiencies. There's a lot of work being done on spread patterns of rain guns versus booms. Sort of touched on it a little bit in my talk there. The difference in terms of the soil's ability to absorb water and not create a flooding event that might cause runoff can come down to the type of irrigation. So whilst a boom is very good at producing a very good lateral evenness of spray irrigation and a very good coverage, what it does do, it does put a high amount of water down in a very short period of time. So it's effectively mimicking a very intense rainfall event. But that's okay so long as your soils can take it. So for our sandy soils that are more open, that water can infiltrate very quickly. And a lot of the work that we do in terms of soil preparation and cultivation is designed around making the soil have as high an infiltration rate as possible, so we can get water into it very quickly. If you use that type of intensity on a very small granulated soil, such as a silt, what you tend to see is that the water puddles on top of the soil and doesn't work its way in. So if you have any degree of slope, then you're increasing the risk of runoff. Downside, obviously, of ray guns is the inaccuracy in their exposure to wind drift, which is what Alan's alluding to there. Sometimes in certain field shapes, fields that have obstacles in, booms are not easy to use. You can maneuver a boom around a telegraph pole, but you have to physically be there to twist it around. So that negates running a boom through the night with a pole in the field. Rain guns are easier to manage. They're cheaper as an investment from an investment perspective. So they have a place to play, but their use has to be managed a lot closer. There's a lot more disciplines involved in it. I think in terms of the times and day, you know, yes, if we could dictate and control our weather patterns, if we could control the wind, the amount of transpiration that we're getting in very intense hot periods, then we would all irrigate at night. The unfortunate nature of irrigation demand is that usually when you need to irrigate, it's very difficult to pick and choose and have an irrigation system that can deliver water at a fast enough frequency, but only in 12 hours in a day. Most people's, I should think 95% of people's irrigation systems are designed to irrigate 24-hour windows. And the frequency that you need to come round will mean that if you lose a half a day, there can be a financial cliff face that you can fall off. I think the important thing to remember is that some of the crops we're growing, some of the quality parameters that we have to grow to, on our light sandy soils, 12-hour window can be the difference between having a crop that's in spec and out of spec from a skin perspective. I think, to be honest, one of the biggest things that would aid more efficient irrigation would actually be if our customers would go back to accepting unwashed fresh produce and ignoring actually buying produce on taste and flavour rather than appearance and uniformity. So much of the water that we use is purely targeted at producing a blemish-free skin and a perfectly shaped vegetable. But actually, if we went away from that, if we went back to, we don't need it looking like a bar of soap and we buy it on taste and flavour rather than odd specks on the skin, we would be able to build a lot more resilience into our water management than we currently have to do. So we don't irrigate for fun. We're driven by our customer specifications.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Andrew. So there's a couple more questions there, so I will round those questions up and collect answers to them, but we're going to have to go to a quick break. But before we go to the break, I'm going to hand over to Jessie because she will briefly explain what is coming next in terms of the workshop